Good evening. I'm very, very happy to be here this evening to talk to Davidar about his new book, A Case of Indian Marvels, which is, I think it would be the best of Indian writing at this point. Young Indian writers under 40, and each one of them, have their piece of writing out there. And in many ways, this book showcases what the future of Indian writing could be. David, as you know, is probably the face of Indian publishing. He set up set up Penguin Random House in India, and my first novel was published by David as well. So it's a kind of a journey for me more than anything else, because it's like after all those years, here is David again, bringing the works of 40 young writers, all under the age of 40 or 40. And I wonder what went into this whole exercise, as in like, what made you think of putting this book together?
Well, I think the central reason I felt I should do this was because it seemed to be an opportunity to see what was out there in terms of younger writers. 7 or 8 years ago, I did a book. I published another anthology where I looked at what I felt were some of the finest stories written by Indian writers generally. Because, as you know, the short story is not a very old form. It starts in the 19th century, and so in about 100, 150 years, I wanted to see what had happened, and that was received quite well. And then it struck me that we don't really know what's going on with the next generation of writers. 30 or 40 years ago, there was very little Indian writing that had in the language I work in, which is English. So, but today you have world-class publishers, you have hundreds of books published, et cetera, But I wanted to try and pinpoint what younger writers were doing. And so this was a voyage of discovery for me more than anything else.
So one of the things that, as an author, that I constantly hear is that short stories don't sell. That, publishers would tell young writers that wonderful short story, but I'd like to read your novel. And probably that's what we'd like to look at first as your debut work of fiction. So why is it that, the publishing world hates short stories so much?
This is a complete mystery to me. I don't think there's any one reason I can pinpoint. I'm as puzzled by it as you are, and I've published, several thousand books. And I can't tell you why short stories don't do as well as novels, unless they are people like Ruskin Bond, V.S. Pritchett, Raymond Carver, people who are known as short story writers. But if you can write a novel, I would always say write a novel first. Do I have any theories? Yes. But do they stand up? No. So the answer is I don't know. So, however, I just think that what I'm very intrigued by is the short story as a form, because in many ways I think it's more difficult to do an almost perfect short story rather than write a novel, because a novel is a more forgiving form. It allows you to make mistakes. So, yeah, that's another reason I wanted to see what younger writers were doing.
Would you like to read the short story that you've written?
Sure. Before that, I think what I would like to read is, we're talking about short stories, we're talking about the writing of fiction, et cetera, but I think it might be interesting to try and define what a great short story is, what great fiction is. So I'll read a few paragraphs from my introduction. Many years ago, on a blustery day in autumn, I took the train from London to Cambridge to meet a man who had taken the Western literary world by storm. I was just starting out in publishing at the time, and I was keen to ask Bill Buford, then the editor of Granta, about the essential quality he looked for in stories he chose to feature in his magazine. We'd arranged to meet in a pub in one of the narrow streets just off the city center. Huddled into my coat against the cold, I set off from the station, through drifts of fallen leaves on the pavements, stirring restlessly in the bladed wind. No sooner had I sat down in the pub, pint in hand, than the door swung open and Buford blew in, a stocky, bearded man in a fisherman's jersey and blue jeans. An American student at King's College, he had stayed on in Cambridge after he took his degree to successfully resurrect and reshape a defunct literary magazine, Granta. Within a short time, his inspired stewardship of the journal had turned it into one of the world's best showcases of contemporary literature. The years have blurred away much of what we talked about, but the essence of what he said lodged in my head. What was necessary to elevate any story or long-form narrative to greatness, in his eyes, was that it needed to be adventurous, original, and above all, have the narrative drive to keep the reader pinned to the page. I never met Buford again, but I was reminded of our drink together recently when his name cropped up in a book by one of the peerless short story writers of our time, George Saunders. Entitled A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, after a Chekhov story, it's about a few of the Russian immortals and their creations. In the introduction, Saunders attempts a definition of what constitutes a flawless piece of short fiction. He writes, years ago, on the phone with Bill Buford, then fiction editor of The New Yorker, to which magazine Buford had moved after his stint at Granta, enduring a series of painful edits, feeling a little insecure, I went fishing for a compliment. But what do you like about the story? I whined. There was a long pause at the other end, and Bill said this, well, I read a line, and I like it, enough to read the next. And that was his entire short story aesthetic, and presumably that of the magazine. And it's perfect. A story is a linear temporal phenomenon. It proceeds and charms us, or doesn't, a line at a time. We have to keep being pulled into a story in order for it to do anything for us.
You're supposed to applaud when somebody finishes reading, so thank you. What made you, what I would ask is like, how did you choose these 40 writers? Did you have like a huge corpus of writers to choose from? How did this book come into being?
The thing is, I think in a country like ours, where there are so many fault lines, there's so much inequality, injustice, so many things that need to be addressed, I think writers have to be political, writers have to sort of take a point of view, writers need to be able to probe things in a different way than journalists or filmmakers or, pretty much everybody else who sort of deals with our day-to-day reality. So you'll find that most of these stories have, they actually take very interesting points of view on things that all of us are concerned about. For example, the political situation, religious fundamentalism, gender inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I found that most of the stories that I personally like are those that tell us beyond cliche about how to understand what's going on in our country.
Right. Some of the stories in this are incredible for the reason that they talk about worlds that a lot of more established writers would not even want to touch upon because they are political in nature. There is also this wonderful expanse of imagination that you see in the writing by some of the writers who are included in this. And I think, what it does for me, as someone who works with young writers, I see this wonderful possibility of where Indian writing in English could go. And I think in that sense, this book is one of those things that ought to be kind of like hallmarked. And then probably in about 10 years' time, you can look back on the careers of the writers who have emerged from here and see where it goes. So what do you think happens to writers who start off with a lot of promise and then at some point it peters out? So What do you think causes that?
Well, I think, all of us have a certain amount of material that we can use. And so that we exhaust over a period of time. But I think, writing, as with everything else, it doesn't descend mysteriously from the heavens. You have to work at it. So I believe that a writer who's run out of inspiration or a writer who does not have any new material to mine should not be writing the same book over and over again, which unfortunately a fair number of writers do. I think writers have to go out and find subjects to immerse themselves and write about. I think today the problem also has to do with publishers, because I think we tend to publish just about anything that we find halfway decent, instead of holding writers to go out there and sort of work hard and do creative, original works. That is my own personal view. I think 30, 40 years ago, when it was really difficult to get published, writers worked harder. Today, they have many avenues to get published, and that, I think, does them a disservice, because then they turn lazy and sort of just phone it in.
Right. Would you like to share something from the book, maybe in a small excerpt from the...
Well, this is an edited volume, and I was sort of trying to understand the short story. But I write fiction as well. So recently I wrote a short story, a very short story, so I'm not going to keep you very long with this one, for a kind of anthology that American Pen did to celebrate 75 years of Indian independence. So I'll just read it out to give you a sense of what my own fiction writing is about. The story is called The Murmurous Dead, a very brief exchange with the spirit. Not so long ago, after a fall, I was laid up in bed. As a result of bruised ribs and stitches in my jaw, sleep was often elusive. One restless night, in the pre-dawn hours, just as grey began filtering through the kachnal trees outside my bedroom window, I had an unexpected visitor. My visitor had neither form nor substance, but was simply a consciousness outside my own. Its voice was nevertheless clear and unmistakable. Sir, my visitor began respectfully. I have a question for you. Who are you? I asked. The voice belonged to the spirit of a 14-year-old girl who died in a communal riot in a small town a few years ago. And what is this question you have for me? I asked. Why, she asked, are there no memorials for us? Rightfully, there are memorials to the brave men and women who gave their lives protecting our country. Their sacrifice should never be forgotten. But how come there are no memorials for us, all of us innocents whom the country failed to protect? Nonplussed, I did not reply immediately, and she spoke up again. There are hundreds of thousands of us who have paid with our lives in this glorious nation of ours because of the acts of commission or omission of our leaders. The least we deserve are memorials, so we will be remembered. But surely, I said weakly, there must be plaques or memorial stones. She interrupted me. Private markers by our families and those who mourn us don't count. We died because the state did not look out for us, so it's the state which should erect memorials for us. She had piqued my interest, so I said, and what form should these memorials take? She said, the form doesn't really matter. Though I would love it if my memorial were to be a garden, or even just a flowering tree in a prominent place in the town where I was killed. An amaltas, or a gulmohar, or a jacaranda. Just imagine if all of us were honored thus, our ugly cities and towns would be transformed into paradisiacal places of shimmering green and yellow and red and violet. I was momentarily lost in the vision she had conjured up until she spoke again. No matter what form each memorial takes, every single one of them has to have an essential component. And what is that? I asked. Each of them must have a plaque listing the names of the leaders who failed us, those who were responsible for our deaths. Our leaders love to put their faces on all sorts of billboards and posters, that are prominently displayed in public places, so their portrait should be engraved on these plaques for all eternity. That way, the part they played in our deaths will never be forgotten. And with that, she was gone, as abruptly as she had appeared, just as the morning light came flooding into the room.
So this brings me back again to the short story as a form. And what is it that, David, you think works best for a short story? What is it about?
Okay, so for that, I'm going to rely on some experts.
Okay.
And I'll read out what they think makes for the perfect short story. Ruskin Bond says, stories should flow like a stream of water, preferably a mountain stream. You will, of course, encounter boulders, but you will learn to go over them or around them so that your flow is unimpeded. Both practitioners and academics have tried for hundreds of years to codify the short story, but there's no one definition that can be taken as definitive. I remember an aside from Anita Nair, another adept of short fiction, on the difficulties of defining the genre. Apparently, he once attended a lecture on creative writing in which the instructor said, a short story must be short and have a story. We laughed about this hapless take on the form, but perhaps we laughed too soon. Here's why. Joyce Carol Oates, the American novelist and short story writer, wrote, formal definitions of the short story are commonplace, yet there is none quite democratic enough to accommodate an art that includes so much variety and an art that so readily lends itself to experimentation and idiosyncratic voices. Perhaps length alone should be the sole criterion. I see the man that Narayan and I were mocking rising above our laughter, and I told you so expression on his face. Oates adds, whenever critics try to impose other more subjective strictures on the genre, too much is excluded. My personal definition of the form is that it represents a concentration of imagination and not an expansion. It is no more than 10,000 words, and no matter its mysteries or experimental properties, it achieves closure, meaning that when it ends, the attentive reader understands why. As a working definition of the genre, that's pretty good, but let Anton Chekhov, who's regarded as the father of the modern short story, have the last word on the subject. Remember that writers whom we call great or just good and who make us drunk have one very important feature. They're going somewhere and calling you with them.
But what does David Davidar think?
Well, I think, there are two or three different kinds of short stories, right? One is what Chekhov did, which is basically a slice of life, and where character and the scene are brought alive, and plot doesn't matter so much. Then there's a plot-driven short story. And then finally, there is a short story where, the beauty of the story is something that the writer consciously tries to do in terms of writing style and so on. I like all kinds of short stories, but if my life was at stake, I would go with a short story where there's a very powerful, the writer is good enough to come up with a very powerful take on something that perhaps all of us witness, but are not able to understand or enter into that kind of narrative in that way. And I think we have some great, great short story writers. For example, my favorite short story from India is an extraordinary story by a Malayalam writer, O.V. Vijayan, who is a friend of mine, called After the Hanging. In this story, a father goes to receive the body of his son, who has been hanged. It's one of the most amazing stories I've ever read. Where did Vijayan come up with that sort of idea? How did he, in the space of a few pages, bring it out so brilliantly? That is, to my mind, a major, major kind of achievement. unfortunately, most people, like Narayan's, definition, think that they, write a short piece of fiction, but I don't know, The Beach, they think that's a short story. Yes, it's a short story, but is it of any worth? I'm not so sure. Just like Vijayan, another writer who I think is quite extraordinary and who wrote some of the most powerful short fiction ever published in this country was Mahashavita Devi. I can't forget most of the stories that I've read by her, whether they were in good translations or indifferent translations. I don't read Bengali. So, so I think that is my preferred form of the short story. Take risks, write about the most dangerous thing, the most difficult thing that you have ever attempted to write about, and hopefully you have the skill to be able to pull it off.
For those of you who haven't seen this book yet, David, you hold it. So this is the book, and the first story that you have here, the alligator.
Yeah, of Aligarh.
Yeah, the alligator of Aligarh is one of the most incredible stories I've read, because what it does is it talks about multiple things. It's so layered. I mean, you don't really expect a short story from a young writer to be so layered. And what is the success of the story is that at no point does it seem contrived, or does it seem like a creative writing exercise. It's just so loaded with wisdom in a kind of very, it's not wisdom that you pass on, but it's wisdom from, you think it's lived experience, but then you realize this is a young writer, and he's written about something that probably is an alien world to him, but he has this incredible ability to transport you into that world, which is basically the sewer system of Aligarh, and where there is an alligator that he's befriended, and what happens thereafter. And I mean, I'm just putting it so very plainly that you lose out on the beauty of the story itself, which is why I would urge that when we are done with this session, you should all go to the KLF bookshop and pick up a copy of this book and read this incredible story and 39 incredible other stories. So I'd like to just come back to this whole business of writing a short story, because I mentor writers on and off. And one of the things that I realize with young writers when they come for mentoring is that all of them come in assuming that writing a short story is a simpler way of, kind of getting their foot into the door rather than writing a long novel, because obviously a novel is a long haul exercise. It's a marathon as compared to probably a 100-meter sprint. And it takes me a long bit of talking to them to convince them that probably it's easier to work on, a novel, because like David earlier said, it's a much more forgiving form. The canvas is vast. Whereas with a short story, it's like working on a miniature painting. So there's a certain bit of self-assured writing that needs to happen there without the writer knowing it's self-assured. Would you have something to add to that?
Well, I think what I was, we read several hundred stories to come up with the stories that are in this volume. What I was most encouraged by was the fact that our younger writers, because these writers belong to the millennial generation and Generation Z, are so engaged with the issues of our time. Now, the problem is, if you're going to be didactic, or if you're going to be, speechifying or whatever, or preaching, your fiction isn't going to be very good. But they have the skill, but they also have the commitment to ideas of India. They have commitments to how they might sort of write about social injustice in a way that is not a tract, but in a way that actually is human. So people talk about these two generations as generations that are confused, and generations are looking for a voice, looking for whatever it is that they should be doing. But I think there are enough of them out there who are really, really sort of, who planted their flag and said, look, we're serious thinkers, creative artists who have the future of the country is very much something that concerns us, and we're going to deal with this in our fiction. So that was one of the things that I was really impressed by.
So do you think that the new generation of writers are probably more courageous than the existing ones?
That's a tricky one. I think we live in a dangerous time. I think writers run the risk of having their heads cut off if they are not cautious about what they do. But I don't think that means that they should shut up. You know, I think it's like they said when Mrs. Gandhi imposed the emergency on India. When you were asked to bend, you crawled, right? So I think there's a lot of that going on in the country today. But I think there are enough people who are saying, all right, fine, you have a point of view, so do I have a point of view. And it speaks to their courage that, I mean, I found several of them feature in this book. I think it speaks to their courage that they're actually sort of, you know, not shrinking away from doing this. But make no mistake, there are enough people who are keeping quiet, there are enough people who are craven, but you can't argue with men with guns and you can't argue with prison cells, really. You know, so if you can do it, you should.
So one of the other things that I did want to speak to you about was, you know, this phrase that is talked about much these days, which is cultural appropriation. And one of the things that was incredibly satisfying to me when I was reading this anthology was that none of these writers were actually even, you know, a little bit bothered by that. They wrote what they wanted to write, and they didn't worry that, you know, oh, I should be somebody who is of a certain community to write about a certain kind of, story. So you have probably writers who live in the US, of Indian origin, writing about maybe a small town, a tea shop, the Kritika Pandey one, for instance, or the Alligator of Aligarh, or Arvind Jain's story, or Dinesh's story. All of these stories have a certain kind of chutzpah to them, which I found very reassuring, because increasingly I've been feeling that writers are so afraid of being told that this is cultural appropriation and you shouldn't be writing about it, that they hold themselves back. Because sometimes you may not be of that culture, but you may have a story to tell, and let's not negate what research and probably some experience can do. So what is your take on cultural appropriation?
See, as a publisher, I've always fought against that, because my take on that is quite simple. Who are you to tell me what I can write about, what I can't write about, what is authentically Indian, what is, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I mean, I think these are all sterile, very, very problematic discussions. Yes, I think there are certain areas that you shouldn't transgress, but I also think the only thing that you should try and always adhere to is write well. You know, I'm not interested in a preachy tract about this or that. I mean, there are people who do that, and they should do it, because, you know, we need to educate ourselves, we need to sort of know, we need to be socialized in the right way. But I don't think you can tell a writer, you can't write about this and you can't write about that. The only thing that is a sin, I think, is bad writing. Yeah.
So the reason why I brought this up was some time ago, a few months ago, I wrote this story about, you know, two young Dalit girls who get admission into a medical college in a North Karnataka college, where this, you know, the class divide and the caste divide is kind of huge. And these girls join a medical college, and they get in because of, you know, the reservation and so on. So obviously, once they're there, they have to contend with a lot of things which that they'd never expected, and how it kind of destroys them and so on. But then I came up for a lot of criticism because I was told that because I happen to have a Nair in my name, I was told that I was a Savarna, doing the cultural appropriation bit about writing about the Dalit community and so on. And I remember when I was talking to one of the editors, she said, I'm really afraid for you when you write the story. And I said, well, the problem is that nobody wants to do it, because everybody's so afraid of being told that you have appropriated something that doesn't belong to you, that they don't want to write about what it can be now for, a lot of people here. Now, when we talk about class and caste divide, it exists at every level, if you look at it, within the Indian society. The degree of difficulty is obviously much more when you are from a marginalized community. So what happens is that, many writers are so afraid of what social media can do to them that they stay away from topics that they should be writing about. So do you think social media has had a certain kind of disturbing influence?
Yes, very much so. I mean, let's make no bones about it. Social media, people who go after people on social media are a lynch mob in everything but name, right? Yes. They are a lynch mob because they destroy reputations, they destroy people's confidence, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to just develop a very thick hide if you're going to write about things that you feel strongly about, mm-hmm. but which somebody else might say you have no business writing about. I think, you can't do things that are unlawful, I think.
Absolutely.
But I do think that you should be able to have an opinion, and your opinion should be as valid and should be as, there needs to be a certain sanctity to protecting that voice. So I don't care if writers transgress.
So, one of the fears that I have for the writers who have contributed to this or whose works have been chosen for this anthology, because it is a privilege to be part of this anthology, is that in time, will they be less brave about what they write? Because here they're young writers, and also they are, in many ways, some of them, of course, are published well-known names, but some others are, pretty much unknown in that sense. They probably have won a prize of some sort or have contributed to an anthology and so on. But these are young names and they're brave and they're unknown, and this factor of being unknown makes them probably very courageous. And this is something that I worry about, that in about 10 years' time, when their works are read much more widely, would they have the same kind of courage to tackle the difficult topics that they've written about in this collection?
I don't know. I think writers have a certain amount of, they have no protection. Look at Salman Rushdie, one of the most protected writers in the world. Protection lifted, some random guy somewhere attacked him. Look in our own country, in adjacent states, people get killed for what they write. Does it put fear into writers so that writers' kind of courage dries up? I'm sure it does, and I don't think you can expect writers to do more than they are willing to do. But, you can't stamp out resistance, you can't stamp out courage, you can't stamp out people's railing against injustice, oppression, dictators, whether in name or in actuality. There will be a resistance. It might be muted at times, it might sort of flare up at other times, but I think if one writer sort of goes quiet, another writer will spring up. That's where I look at it.
I'd like to open the floor for questions, because apart from talking to David about a case of Indian marvels, I also think that he's probably the best person you can ask questions about Indian publishing and publishing in general, and he's a writer himself. So over to you. Questions?
Good evening. I actually had a comment to make and then a question to ask you. The comment is this.
Hear you. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, sir? Yeah. I actually had a comment to make and then a question to ask you. The comment is just this, that this is North Kerala, T. Padmanabhan country. T. Padmanabhan is one of the most celebrated short story writers up here in North Kerala and the master craftsman. My question to you, sir, is what kind of influence should editors / publishers influence exert on young authors when they're published?
What?
I asked this specifically because you mentioned Raymond Carver in the introduction, and we all know that there are multiple versions of Carver's stories available. So what kind of influence should editors exert, and what kind of influence do you exert?
It really is a very good question, because what the gentleman was referring to was Raymond Carver's editor actually rewrote some of the stories and published them in a form that apparently Carver himself did not necessarily subscribe to. My take on this is quite simple. I believe that writers, no book is perfect, no piece of fiction is perfect, no piece of writing is perfect, and if a writer is lucky, they find an editor who's a kindred spirit and who actually helps them make the piece of writing the best it could possibly be from the writer's own voice, in the writer's own voice. It is not the editor's book, it is not the editor's story, it is not the editor's piece of long-form narrative, it is the writer's. So, for me it's quite simple. I will work with a writer, but the writer has the final veto on every single edit. So, I get edited myself. And I'm very grateful to my editors because they actually make my work better, I think. But if you're trying to change the thing around to make it, to have your own perspective or, reflect your voice, I think that's wrong. There's a lady, can we give
Hello, sir. What I'd like to ask you is a good story well told enough to get published? Or as a publisher, what are you looking at to publish a book? Does the author need a godfather? Or does the book need saleability, so to speak? How do we get a good story well told out there? How do we get it published? What do we need to do?
I think, good stories that are well told are rarer than you think. Most of them are not very well told, so my job is easy. I can just say no. Still, whether something is going to be commercially viable or not is secondary in my view. I will take a risk with a book that's quite brilliant, that falls within my kind of area of interest. I'm just one publisher. There are thousands of publishers. So I will publish something that I am interested in. If it's well written, you don't need a godfather. You don't need any other kind of inducement for me to take your work seriously. Yeah.
Hi, sir. I work as an AI researcher and AI ethicist. So I lead the Government of India's program on AI. So my question is, we are living in a time of generative models and content is being created, even essays, articles, stories, poems being created by these machine learning models. So what is, as a publisher, your take on an author incorporating this kind of, let's say, maybe a chapter or maybe more than that, generated by these computer models?
I actually don't have an answer to that question. You know, I usually deal with humans, so if a computer sent me something or a computer-generated piece of fiction came to me, I wouldn't know quite what to do with it. So it's not within my experience.
Hi, good evening. You spoke about an element of politics in a story. So, do you think a story itself, without an element of politics, can stand itself? Why I ask you this question, I'm here to read your book, your anthology. You spoke about there is a situation in India now when we are told to bend, we crawl. So, can I expect a story with a different narrative in your anthology, or all the stories are with same narrative? I hope you understand what I mean. Because most of here in Kerala, most of the journals, they publish a story with a particular narrative. They don't, I mean, it's a publisher's right. So can I expect a story with a different narrative in your anthology?
In this anthology?
Yeah, exactly.
All the stories are different. I think they cover a great deal of ground. I think some are very political. The others tend to just be great pieces of short fiction. I think the overtly political stories would be about 25% of the anthology. But otherwise, there's a great range to be found.
Good evening, sir. I'm Babu from this area. I've read some of your pieces in newspapers earlier, and I've always been, I've heard that, you know, constantly the works of authors have been rejected by the publishers. What is the frequency, or how much works are being rejected, you know, on a regular basis by editors like you?
Okay, I'll tell you from the perspective of my publishing company, we reject about 95% of what we get.
So that's a huge disappointment for an author to come up, because, you know, he has to face that initial challenge, and, you know, coming up against those authors itself make him very terrible in his efforts.
I haven't told you why I reject them.
Okay.
It's not because I dislike the writers or the writing doesn't appeal to me or whatever. I think pretty much everything that I've rejected has never found a publisher because they're just bad pieces of writing. It's one of the things I feel very strongly about. I think, you know, you have to work hard on your writing. I don't think people work very hard on their writing. The people who get rejected, not here. I mean, outside, you know, there are different things that are at play. But I think I can say with a fairly clear, clean conscience that nothing that I've actually turned down has then gone on to become a great success because the writing was so brilliant.
Okay. Anyway, we can be very positive about the situation in India, and I assume that more and more people are coming up, the work being published like publishers like you. I hope. I hope more people are succeeding in their effort to publish.
I hope so too. I let a million writers bloom, but, you know, let good writers bloom.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
It's on, right? Hi, sir. My question is regarding the business of publishing. So there are a lot of changes because, as you yourself mentioned, that there is a democratization in publishing. Anyone can go and self-publish things, And there are multiple formats are getting involved, and people are reading books not directly through reading, even audibles are coming up. How you think actually publishing as a business, is it innovating? What are the challenges you are facing, and how the innovation happening in your field? That means in the
innovation?
Innovation in the publishing as a.
Well, you know, innovation, I think basically what publishers do is they are the kind of, they're the filter and they're gatekeepers, so to speak, between writers and readers, okay? The day writers are able to beam stories directly into the reader's brain, publishers will vanish. Until such time, publishers have a role. Now, most of the things that are happening at the moment are have to do with format, you know, whether it's digital, whether it's kind of e-singles, whether it's online sales. So it's actually process rather than a fundamental change in the way writing is published. And oddly enough, when digital publishing came on stream, people figured that the physical book would vanish. That hasn't taken place. Today, actually, physical books sell more than e-books all over the world, including in places like South Korea and the States, where there's maximum penetration of digital publishing. In India, I think it's less than 20%. So change is happening very, very slowly. What innovation should publishers be doing? At this point, not much. I think we should be innovative where marketing is concerned, where selling is concerned. But I think the basic kind of formula that we that exists in terms of acquiring a manuscript, editing a manuscript, packaging a manuscript, I think that's fine.
Good evening, sir. Just adding on to his question, the challenges that digital printing poses to the physical copies that get printed, don't you think we are losing out on a very big share in the market that way? Isn't it very unethical when we, download e-copies very free or through various sources? It's a big drainage for the author as well as the publishing industry as a whole.
Yeah, I think piracy is a crime, right? I mean, unless something is offered to you for free, if you are illegally downloading something, you're stealing. So can publishers police these things better? Unfortunately not. We don't have the resources to do it. So it's left to the end user not to do things that they should not be doing. But beyond that, I don't think there's much that we can do.
Hi. You mentioned that most of the books that you reject are badly written. How do you define badly written? And if possible, can you give us some examples of some terrible writing you've come across?
You know, the most basic thing, which is bad grammar, incorrect language, in whichever way you define it, characterizes about 50% of what we turn down, okay? Also, people who don't make the effort to actually work on their writing. Now, look, all of us who write didn't magically sort of come up with the books that we publish, right? You go through a long apprenticeship, which means that you read everything worth reading in the genre that you sort of want to work in. It could be literary fiction, it could be crime fiction, it could be horror fiction, it could be, I don't know, romance, whatever. You have to serve your apprenticeship. You have to know how a book works. You have to know how a chapter begins, how a chapter ends, how a narrative sort of unfolds, how a character is built up, how plot works, how the first-person narrative works, third-person narrative works. Most of the books that I turn down, I don't need to read beyond the first 40 pages to know this person has probably not read a book in their life. So that accounts for most of the books that I turn down. There are other books that simply don't fit my area of interest. I mean, if somebody sends me a textbook on physics, why is that person sending me, again, lazy thinking, right? My website tells me what kind of books I'm looking for, what kinds of books I'm interested in, what kinds of books I publish. So I don't think I've personally been unfair to the person I say no to.
Good evening. I would like to ask you, as a publisher, do you receive more and more short stories or books to read that would have a connection with the encompassing problem that is ours now, which is how the living world is going to keep on living?
Well, I personally, turned off the tap about a year ago. I said I'm not going to look at any more manuscripts unless they came through agents or people who vetted them for me. If you're asking about climate change and how the world is on a kind of doomed kind of trajectory, yes, I'm interested in books like that if they're told well. For me, the book needs to be successful, successfully written, well written, well structured. The message is important, but for me, finally, everything needs to come together.
Good evening. Sir, as a writer...
I can't hear you.
Good evening. Sir, as a writer, I just like you as a writer, just want to know, there is so much of research done on subjects nowadays, like there's so much access to content on what you're writing. Do you think people have stopped telling a story rather than summarizing so much of research? How important do you think were to stop a research and just be spontaneous storytelling?
I think research is very important because I think you're writing, if you're talking about literary fiction, for example, which is what I'm most interested in, I think it needs to be very firmly grounded in stuff that is not commonly known or is unique to the story that you're trying to tell. I think many writers I know will read tons of books. I mean, they might even read an entire book to write a paragraph, right? But you're right in saying that at some point, the narrative has to lift off beyond just the sum of all your research. But that's what creative writing is all about. So you write and you write and you write. At some point, the plane takes off. So yes, I think the great books will have an equal mixture of content, which is sort of well-researched, but also brilliant kind of, creative work, which is purely due to the talent of the writer.
Hello.
We have time for one last question. So,
Hello. Can you see me? I'm here.
I can't see you.
Right
I can't see you.
here. Can you see?
Yes, I can see
Okay,
you.
my question is more for Anita ma'am, as she made a comment on appropriation and social media and the comments made against authors on social media. So I don't know, you received flack on the book that you wrote and you made an example there, but do you think that due to social media and there is a sense of accountability that comes for writers in the sense that every industry in India is kind of herded by upper class or community. So due to social media, do you think that since there is an accountability and there is a need for you to express your, for people to express their opinion, there is a space, you think that authors from the scheduled caste and other oppressed communities are being able to showcase their works more, or like, there is a space to, publish their works?
So I have an answer for that is basically yes, I do know a few writers, young writers in fact, who've left Twitter, for instance, for being hounded for what they've written. It may not be a novel that they wrote or a short story they wrote, but it could be an essay that they wrote, right? So I know I've seen how it can destroy the confidence that you have. Because, all writers, one of the things that we have in abundance is self-doubt. So when you have the world, and you don't know, random strangers, being hurtful, offensive, being brutal, and though a part of you tells you that, I don't know who this person is, and this person could just be taking my trip for the sake of taking it. At the end of it, we are all human beings. And so there is this sense of feeling hounded and feeling wounded and all of that, right? So what happens is that social media can detract good writing. It can curb good writing. It can make people hesitate to put their work out there. And unfortunately, given that, or for whatever, given that the way the world has changed and how social media seems to have a huge impact on the way people pick up books or listen to music or watch a film or a show, in a kind of very insidious way, it has its huge impact on the way we look at the way we consume culture. So my fear is that now someone like me who's been around for a bit, where I know what I'm doing, and yes, at this point too, I'm somebody who's hurt as probably a young writer starting out. It doesn't change. You just develop a thicker hide and you learn to put it behind you. But I think the problem here is that social media everybody is a self-appointed critic. And nobody is thinking about the effort that goes into the making of a film or the writing of a book or, a song that's composed, etc. And it's just knee-jerk reactions most of the times. And knee-jerk reactions don't necessarily have to be thought-out reactions, right? Because they're obviously knee-jerk. And the reason it happens is obviously the person who has seen it or read it or heard it has taken a violent dislike to it. And sometimes they're just influenced by other social media influences. So these become the self-appointed custodians of culture, especially in a country as diverse as ours. So that is why I keep talking about what is the impact of social media. And while I do tell the writers I mentor that they need to build a digital footprint, I also tell them to develop a thick hide to go with it. Thank you. With that, we come to the end of a case of Indian marvels. And thank you, David, for being here and for bringing out a wonderful book like this. I think India was ready for a book like this. And it's been, 25 years since you set up Penguin first. And thereafter, 25 years, it seemed like a great time to kind of commemorate the passage of Indian publishing itself. So, are you going to be signing? Okay, so the books are available at the bookshop. Please do go pick it up because honestly, I loved reading it, and I think I would urge all of you to read it as well. Thank you.